Welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marianne Clements, initiator of this conference, writer and consultant, and facilitator of the replenishment room. And this conversation is with Tobias Denskus. In our conversation, we talk about communicating about development and how it's shifting and changing, and what about it we think really needs to shift. And we also talk about what it might mean to decolonize international development and how we can make day-to-day different choices as white people from the global north who are committed to global solidarity, but concerned that the ways in which we might have been operating in the past are too much about us taking up space rather than inviting solidarity and stepping out of the way when we need to. So I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Tobias as much as I enjoyed having it. Enjoy. So hi and welcome to the Healing Solidarity Conference again, and I am here with Tobias Denskus. I hope I said that right. And he's a senior lecturer in communication for development at the School of Arts and Communications at Malmö University in Sweden, and he blogs regularly at Aidnography. And maybe I'll just invite you to start by telling us about that and about what you've been blogging there, because I know you regularly compile articles about current issues in aid and development as well as your own reflections. So that's a really useful resource for me, and I'm sure for lots of other people. So I'd like to just hear a bit about that.
Excellent. Well, thanks for inviting me, Marianne. I mean, it's a pleasure joining online, especially since this is also sort of a large part of what I'm doing for a living. I'm in charge of our online blended learning master's program in communication for development. And actually, Zoom is now one of our kind of premier tools that we are using in teaching and in connecting to students. So I think that's a nice environment to have some of those discussions across countries and continents. So that's really nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are asking some broad and tough question, which is excellent. And I think one of the issues that I feel where my work and my teaching and my writing comes in is that this sort of interesting trajectory between communicating development differently, usually outside of traditional academic outputs, and then sort of at the intersection of media and communication studies, a little bit of journalism and more traditional research on development and sometimes humanitarian issues. And I mean, one thing you were asking about sort of how the sector is changing. I think the communicative environment is changing, and I don't just want to follow sort of the usual kind of, oh my God, it's bad, and Facebook is horrible and there's lots of manipulation going on. Because one of the things I find quite interesting is for example the 50 Shades of Aid Facebook group.
Right, absolutely.
Which is a fascinating space that really sort of in many ways brings out the best that people had hoped. When you have asked someone 5 years ago, what would a Facebook group or Facebook community to look like? The work that Imogen and others are doing on the site is probably pretty much almost an ideal case study. There's no abuse and shouting, there's no anger, but there's still, I think, 18,000 members now.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And I found that is a really interesting resource because it really brings together a lot of the important issues, but also from very, very different angles and approaches. So there is expert aid work discussions, local aid work discussions, mental health and well-being, and also, which I find important, a little bit of humor and snark and other things going on. And I think that's a really I think that reflects some of the broader changes of how development work has become much more of a mainstream profession. And I think that's also where some of the challenges lie. Is now development is a professional industry to some extent. And I think almost by default that makes it susceptible to the problems that many other industries have. How how to have women in positions of power and leadership. This is not specific to the aid industry. You go to entertainment. I mean, I'm working in academia. Even in Sweden, we have those discussions. So it reflects the challenges of what's going on in society.
Yeah.
And I think that's always important, I feel, to keep in mind is, before, there's finger pointing saying, oh, this is particular about development, this is particularly bad. I mean, it doesn't make anything better to say, well, it happens in other, pointing finger at other industries or other sectors of society. But it is sort of the aid industry is as good and as bad or as bad as sort of society around it. It's not sort of something that sits outside. It has, higher values or better aspirations. I mean, it is sort of, it is as good as or as bad as the people who work in it and want to make it better.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think that it probably is the case that a lot of us join the sort of AIDS development industry, for want of a better word, with some kind of aspiration that in some way it might be a better thing to do. And of course, the reality is it's hard and difficult work in so many ways. And I think it reminds me of all the stuff you collated around the Oxfam scandal and Aid 2 and stuff, because, that's one of the things that people have obviously said about the allegations of sexual abuse of various kinds that have been emerging in the sector is, should the aid sector have higher standards, or is this just something that we've got a problem with in our culture? And I swing a bit myself between those two places, because I think, it is something that's a problem in our culture, and that's where, of course, it shows up. And then I also think, that maybe there's responsibilities we have if we're saying certain things about our values that would lead us to need to be, acting. So I wondered what emerged from you from all those articles, because I know you read pretty much everything that came out.
I think one important issue is because a lot, if not most, of aid work is funded either through taxpayers or through donations, which again is taxpayers giving money to organizations. I mean, there's absolutely a need for increased scrutiny. If you work in kind of banking and finance, there's almost an assumption that you don't work for the good guys.
Right.
And I think so. The moment where this amount of it is tax money, but also it is happening usually outside of our country. We are traveling abroad to some distant place to do stuff. And I think those two elements are really important to say, yes, this requires a certain amount and probably higher amount of accountability than other forms. And excuse me, and it's also, I think, expected from society. So, so I think that's important. I really read a lot when the Oxfam scandal came out. It is from an academic or research perspective, it was fascinating. Although obviously the issue at heart is very horrible and deserves lots of investigations into individuals and organizations and structures.
Yeah.
There are a few interesting, I feel, themes that emerge. One theme was really that the moment the original Oxfam scandal about the situation in Haiti broke, many more colleagues, especially women, came forward with and really kind of opened up for lots of more debates, which I found was really important. So it wasn't just focusing on what happened in Haiti. Was it illegal? Was it inappropriate? But it was really open up to say, wait, this is one issue, but there are many issues that I, as a woman of color, that I, as a aid worker from the global South, have experienced.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, I think, in terms of the way it was reported, that there was quite a dichotomy. There is sort of a BBC, Guardian, other websites who really featured those voices. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Times, which still is a Murdoch-owned news company, really sort of stuck to partly investigative journalism, but I still think it was, it has a right of the center political agenda. Not as terrible as the Daily Mail, but there was also an undertone, that there is that. I would go as far as to say the Times didn't just do it for the journalistic or investigative journalistic urge, but because there is a substantial critical part of society in the UK and elsewhere that has fundamental issues with the way that we are wasting taxpayers' money in Africa.
Yeah.
And I think that's also an interesting an interesting sort of topic to keep in mind is that even those who come forward or and share stories, not all of them sort of have higher motives and want to actually change the sector for the better, but also maybe want a more radical agenda to say, this is a pervasive issue, so maybe we should stop sending white men or white people to Africa to do development work.
Yeah. And so I'm interested in what kind of response would you have to that, to that sort of argument, which I very much agree, I think was probably actually behind some of the fact that, those revelations coming when they did and as they did. Because as most of us in the sector know, there are these kinds of issues do exist just like they do everywhere else. But what will be your response to that as a person who sort of situates their work within development and communications and development?
My general response is always to say most of development aid delivers incredible value for money. It is always small, and I'm always I'm tempted to say tiny part of any kind of public budget.
Yeah.
Yes, that still means, you should use resources in a responsible, accountable way. But if we look at defense budgets or any kind of other, global forces, development is actually a ridiculous small amount of money.
Yeah.
And even if, we say the majority of that funding is spent reasonably well, we as countries in the North, as donors, as taxpayers, we are getting a lot for relatively little money. And that's important to keep in mind. The other issue I find important is if not every development projects deliver sort of high impact and behavior change and improves the lives of thousands of people, but there's always an element of solidarity, which is also really important, especially in this day and age when we talk about asylum, when we talk about migration and all these issues. There is a way that it is important to have that element of global solidarity. That we say there are limitations. It's an imperfect offering. There are lots of issues we need to discuss, but at the end of the day, we have the ability to use a small amount of money to create some form of global solidarity and show alternatives way of organizing, engaging, civil society, women's empowerment, and so on. And again, that is important that we keep this debate, especially now in the global North, where there is a lot of populism, right-wing parties, and so on, that we remind people, of that importance of a shared sort of human core of solidarity and kindness that we should aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. And I'm interested from your sort of perspective of looking at communications and media. How do you see that the media and maybe the media and then maybe, communications for development within development, I guess those things cross over a bit. But how do you see that can support that sense of global solidarity without falling into the traps that we know exist around how we present development work and this whole concept of, poverty porn and what that does in terms of communicating messages about people elsewhere in the world and that kind of thing? Big question.
It is. No, it is. It is sort of a little bit of $1 million question, because I think it's on the one hand, we have been seeing, incredible resources around development journalism popping up in the last couple of years, whether it's the Guardian development pages, it's Iron News, and there are many other resources, Bright magazine, fantastic sort of different forms, humanitarian journalism, more sort of factual development journalism, long form essays, fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of it is difficult to finance. It's not sort of financial viable. I mean, it relies on donors, on sponsors, on other contributions. And it is probably fair to say that a lot of it is not sort of pollinating the other side. I mean, there is, always be careful with the word filter bubble, but there is sort of an in-group,
Yeah,
that reads The Guardian, and I'm sure Republican senators in the US are probably not tuning in to read The Guardian when they are, creating policies for developing countries. I mean, so there is that, there is that divide again, like everywhere else in society and with media. And that is that is a real challenge. So we have high quality media. And unfortunately, those who get the most attention, and the Daily Mail website is one of the most visited news websites globally. So obviously, when they have their kind of message on the 13 billion pound waste or something, their kind of project, they get obviously they get a lot of attention. It was interesting, the recent case when Daily Mail was criticizing Rwanda and the Ministry of Tourism sponsoring Arsenal Football Club. That sort of there is this sort of force coming out from the Daily Mail, and then there is a nice factual press release on DFID's website, which also I think shows you the power imbalances. Is DFID, the content was good. Yes, they had data, they had facts, they explained it, but obviously there's millions of people on the Daily Mail website, and then a few click on DFID's homepage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we those power imbalances we have in global media, obviously, very very dominant in development as well. But I also think what is important, and that's maybe something that is discussed less, is that we also need sort of good journalism in developing countries.
Yeah.
And very often there's again, there's a very entrepreneurial spirit in large countries, Nigeria, Kenya. There's lots of news outlets, and websites and newspapers, and some of them are quite terrible in terms of journalistic standards. So we also have that responsibility that we can't just blame everything on the Daily Mail, but we also have to see, how do we make sure that we have, ethical, responsible reporting in countries where a lot of the development issues are, are part of daily reality. Like how in a country like India, again, huge dichotomies within the society. Like, how do we make sure that that the leading news sites and newspapers in India, Bangladesh, also report ethically and fair and transparent about development issues?
And those are really big questions. But what occurs to me as you're talking is that there's something about the growing breadth of media we're able to access, even in the last sort of decade or so with the internet and stuff, that means that at least there is that possibility for us to see a wider range of voices if we know where to look. And you're right that doesn't immediately impact a Daily Mail reader who's probably never going to look for those things. But there is something I feel positive about in the sort of leveling of to some extent the leveling of what's available, So now it's about how do you kind of impact that balance, isn't it, of who's reading what.
And I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think we have really excellent news resources at our fingertips. I mean, just recently the Iron News was talking about Central African Republic, which is a conflict that isn't sort of featured in your daily kind of newscast. And that was also a reminder that no matter what the quality of journalism reporting is, at the end of the day it requires political action. And if countries don't see a need to get involved in one way or another in the Central African Republic, no amount of reporting, will necessarily change it. So the fundamental problems that have been around it's not internet age. I mean, it's 30, 40 years ago. Is the dichotomy between, the amount of information you have and the willingness of key donors, international actors, international organizations to come in and actually do something.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about the tweet you have pinned at the moment, which it's about a guest post from Ami V. Haha, I think, about colonialism and the need to push anti and decolonial viewpoints. And in some ways, I feel like it's a central topic in what I'm trying to do with the Healing Solidarity Conference, because I think like a big part of healing what we're doing in development and making sure that we're in kind of a relationship to our work which avoids some of these things, is making sure that we're sort of actively in or understanding what it means to be anti or decolonial. But I think it can be hard to get our heads around what that looks like in practice. I wonder what thoughts you might have about that.
I mean, on the one hand, as you can see, I mean, I'm speaking from a very privileged position as a white European man with a full-time employment at a Swedish university.
Sure.
So I think one of my sort of strategies is actually to I don't want to say less visible, but also making sure that that my that for me the decolonization also means that it's maybe not me but traveling to a conference talking about decolonization, but also actively saying I'm not traveling to a conference to increase the white male researcher ratio, but I'm staying home and do something else, or join online, but so leave the stage to others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I mean, especially for development work, I mean, there is obviously, I mean, there's so much local talent everywhere now. I mean, in many ways, the traditional expat models will definitely come under more pressure than they are right now. And again, for good reasons, because that talent exists. So it is less about me as a researcher, as a teacher, go somewhere and feel that that I need to teach a group, but it's really about being able to take myself back. And I mean, the small parts that I can do as a teacher is, I mean, we have discussions in our teaching team about reading lists, and really how that's a very small part, is how do we get diverse reading lists, and
Mm-hmm.
first step is always increase the number of female authors. But in our field, it is also important to say we really need to we need to find almost the impossible balance between male and female authors, authors from Africa, and other marginalized spaces. And that's a huge effort that requires a lot of work. But again, it's I think it's that kind of work that needs to be done, like in the office, in the library, in not very exciting meetings you have regularly at university, to push for
Mm-hmm.
these small changes and say there are these is it young writers, is it fiction writers, is it a writer like Nenio Corafor, who writes fantastic science fiction with
Mm-hmm.
based on African characters and in Africa, and to highlight this and show this to students and say this these are the discussions, the discourses, the people you should listen to. And then yes, you may still need to read a little bit of Bourdieu and Foucault at some point, but
Mm-hmm.
to really sort of make sure that that those diverse voices can be incorporated, can be a guest lecture, or so this way of taking a bit more of a backseat, I think is an important first step.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of how that might translate into our organizations, because I think, if anything, our organizations could well be behind academics in this. And I see, a lot of people writing now about an issue that I think we've kind of known is there, but how many of our organizations are staffed by, white Western people. And I wonder about, how that can shift in a way that's meaningful and effective. And I wonder for myself, like, is there really any role for white Western people in in this work, and what I come to really is this idea of what does it mean to be in solidarity without, as you rightly said, like without making myself the center of everything. And it's it feels like it's like a thing to sort of practice in every small thing I do, rather than like a destination to get to. And I think in some ways that's what's challenging about it, because it's like you're saying, you know, each and every reading list, or each and every what you're choosing to do in the course, all these small things matter. So yeah.
And you know, an interesting example, I mean, where I think, you know, those discussions really, you know, come together is, I mean, one of our students, she works for Malmö City, and you know, Malmö being a Swedish city that is, you know, changing very rapidly, new families, immigrants, asylum seekers, students, so you know, lots of, you know, new people coming into the city.
Yeah.
And one thing that our student was working on was using some really kind of old school, you know, like Robert Chambers participatory development approaches, and really sort of bring that to the discussions in Malmö City Council. And this is, I mean, you know, Malmö City Council is already, you know, very liberal, very open space, you know, lots of young people and good ideas. But for them, you know, some of those things we take for granted were really kind of, you know, almost revelations. You know, so you know, so, you know, we have been, you know, talking about putting the last first, you know, since it was 1983, maybe.
It's something like that. I looked at it yesterday. Yeah, it was.
and it's really interesting that, you know, those approaches and ideas and methods, you know, can benefit now in some of the decision making in, you know, how to design an area of Malmö. And I think that's a really good, you know, reminder that, you know, there is, you know, when we talk about the underlying issues, power issues, inequalities, exclusion, you know, whose voices get heard and who may be excluded, you know, we can use those 50, 60 years of experience from international development and really kind of, you know, look at our own environments in cities and universities and organizations, because that's, you know, that's again where, you know, where those approaches can still make a difference in you know, in a very important environment.
So that's an interesting sort of alternative way of using the learning, isn't it? To kind of use it where you are, and I guess that's, yeah, that feels like a really positive way to use something like Chambers' work. But I also think a lot about how we use those sort of terms and practice, you know, those terms about participation and putting the last first, and I do see in the sector, in sort of practice, some of that being really, you know, language that we use but don't necessarily act on. And I wonder how you see that, you know, the kind of the discourse of participation and kind of putting the last first, and those, that kind of language not necessarily being reflected in how we actually do things. I don't know what your experience of that is. Maybe I'm hypercritical on that, but
no, I mean, I quite the opposite. I mean, I mean, I think there's still a lot of work to be done, because I mean, it is like, if truly participatory approaches are, you know, often what large organizations don't want to. They are time consuming, expensive. They may not have tangible outputs. They may not even have an impact. So they are still something that, you know, that is difficult to sell, and it's especially difficult to sell now, where, you know, for example, monitoring evaluation has been changing so much, partly because of, you know, RCTs, behavioral economics. That, you know, it's one thing to say, you know, what happens if we increase teachers' salary by 15% in one part of Indonesia. And to look at outcomes, rather to say, you know, should we have a participatory workshop where, you know, the economist walks in and says, well, how are we going to measure this? You're just sitting in a room, or you're sitting in a village, and, you know, and you talk to people. That's, you know, that's not impact. That, you know, so it's really difficult to you know, to find that space. But I think it's also, I mean, we also know a lot about the downsides of, you know, sort of the forced participation, inviting people who don't want to be invited or too busy to be invited. So, you it's again, I mean, it requires really a long, a long view on complicated issues, and that's that's still very, very difficult to implement. And obviously, I mean, that I would say includes my own workplace. It's much easier said than done, especially if you are in some kind of organizational structure. It's one thing to say your voice gets heard, but then when you look around how organizational structures work, it's still different. I mean, another interesting example was one of our students was looking at participatory communication around a CEDAR project in Latin America.
Yeah.
And it was okay, but it was also interesting that, when she shared the resource in the reference list, that there were a lot of sort of 10, 15-year-old references. So even an organization like CEDAR, who is implementing feminist foreign policy, who's helping the Swedish Foreign Ministry in their efforts to, bring, high quality female candidates to UN organizations. Fantastic. But it still felt a bit, slightly outdated. So it is also sort of, I think, for many organizations still, we did that 10 years ago, the whole participation thing. So are we finished? And then you realize, it's like, well, no, because whether it's technology or, anything else, I mean, there are so many changes. It requires you to be on your toes. And again, many organizations don't have the resources. They had a 5-year project from 2001 to 2006. And then, it feels, okay, we have our, guidelines and, we included it in, a few guidance notices. But how do we make sure that, this reflects the reality of 2018?
Yeah. And what does participation mean in a world that has changed quite a lot since Chambers wrote that? I guess I wanted to pick up on what you said about the long view, because I actually think that could be a sort of critical shift in our thinking, because we're so used to sort of the 2-year, the 3-year, maybe the 5-year project, the very longest, perhaps the 10-year project. And I think about we know that things change incredibly in, say, 100 years if we look back in history, but often in the 3 years we see, we're trying to measure impacts that may actually not be that meaningful or may not look that significant. And so I think about how could we communicate that long view, thinking about communicating, how could we communicate a long view of development? I don't really have an answer, but I wonder if you have any thoughts.
I'm always tempted to say, I'm thinking more about the opposite. I mean, I'm not traveling to Africa as much as I would like, but when I'm also seeing, when it comes to how the culture is shifting in urban centers, if I'm looking at Lagos or Dar es Salaam or Nairobi, there's so much stuff happening,
That's true,
in real time that, I wouldn't want to be the person who says, can you give us an idea, what we can do about urban development in Accra in 10 years time. I mean, it is incredibly difficult, because there is, I mean, it's partly, it's population growth, urbanization, but there is also, when it comes to everything from, fashion, literature, poetry, startups, I mean, there's so much happening that development in some of its ways will never be able to build that in. To say, what will be technological trends in Southern Africa in the next 5 years, again, it's a really, really challenging way, especially if, somebody needs to write a budget and somebody needs to allocate money, and that's really difficult.
True.
At the same time, I think, there are a few things that, that we can, when we look back, I think we can learn from looking at a more historical perspective, which is usually about, the foundations of most of development haven't really changed. If you want to address, inequalities, if you want to, work with marginalized communities, this has been around since the 60s and 70s. And that is still, I think, what should guide, a lot of the work that we are doing is like, what is it? And it's not just, economic empowerment or, growth in income, which is one aspect, but it is really about, how can we transform societies, that are more inclusive and have more opportunities, but also allow citizens to be in charge, and that could be in charge of their data, in charge of their lives, in charge of their, professional careers. And again, I mean, that's incredible hard to achieve, especially if you want to put this to scale. But at least I think it should be the something that should be driving us. It's not to say, oh, wouldn't it be fantastic if Google and Facebook were, wherever you're in Africa, but then sort of the longer view is to say, okay, what happens if there is, more data, more problems, more issues around privacy, maybe some regimes who don't want to use those tools for good, but, for oppression, so again, projecting it is difficult, but it is also possible, especially if you don't follow every hype cycle and, and say, oh, this is about blockchain, or, oh, this is about startups, but, really think about what is it, sort of what are the real core values that you and your organization have that go beyond a tool or, a 2-year project.
Yeah, the latest fashion. I think that's a really, it's a really important point to maybe end on is, coming back to the values of the organization and the people in them as a sort of way to organize what you choose to do, rather than, I do think we tend to get swept up in the latest development fad. So thank you, Tobias. I really enjoyed our conversation. And can you remind us, just for people listening, what the URL for your blog site is, so people can find what you're writing there?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way, it's ethnography, as in ethnography, just with 8, and then it's .de, and then you will see some of my academic and not so academic writing and using. So again, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Bye.
You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Tobias Denskus, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas and suggestions we discussed in this talk and in any of the others in the Healing Solidarity Conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this conference and get access to recordings, more detailed workbooks and ongoing conversations about these topics. Just click the link below the video to find out more. Thank you.